Thanks, Eric. So I think we're all going to learn a lot from this about trafficking, what it is in the United States, and how it might show up in the communities that we are in, and what counselors can do about it. We have a terrific lineup of people who are really experts on all this. So we have Carrie Escheid from the Freedom Network USA. We have Nkuru Abduba from the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, and we have Carlos Sanchez-Adams from the National Consumer Law Center. They're really the area experts, and we're going to hand it over to them. I'm going to let them, they wanted to have a more detailed introduction of themselves. That's great, but we're very interested in what they can share with us. So Carrie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bruce. And hi, welcome everyone. My name is Carrie. I identify with the pronoun she, her. I am the housing project manager at Freedom Network USA. I reside in Iowa and am happy and excited to be able to lean into this conversation with you all. The first portion that I'll kind of focus on will be that really this intersection of identifying human trafficking and what that means like in the realm of housing work. Prior to doing this training and technical assistance work with Freedom Network USA, I have multiple years of experience working with survivors of violence in the intersection of housing. And that ranged from shelter, emergency shelter, access 24/7 for survivors of violence, as well as community-based rental assistance. And so all of my work previously doing this on the ground, working with survivors of violence and accessing and maintaining permanent housing support. So excited to be able to have that and lean into that and share with you all here today. If we can go to next slide, please. So really, I just wanted to just give a brief overview of Freedom Network USA and the Housing and Training Technical Assistance Project that I am part of. So this portion of our presentation today, it is brought to you by us, Freedom Network USA, our Housing and Training and Technical Assistance Project, which is funded by the Office for Victims of Crime. And the focus of our Training and Technical Assistance Project is to provide support and resources to service providers, OVC-funded housing grantees, and folks operating in this intersection of serving human trafficking survivors and housing. And we really lean in on understanding and helping folks understand what that means to kind of best practice for serving survivors of trafficking and housing, as well as connecting people to additional housing options and resources, right? We want folks to learn from each other in the field and doing this work and serving folks in a way that is best practice and meaningful for them. I also, with our program and project, myself and my colleagues, we produce, quarterly webinars, fact sheets, resources, all focused in that intersection of trafficking and housing support. So we have additional resources on our resource library that I'll be able to drop a link here in the chat shortly. And then also, if folks want to know more about Freedom Network USA broadly and the work that we do in supporting and advocating for survivors of trafficking, that'll also be found on our website. If questions do come through the chat, I just kind of have that minimized right now, so I'll be able to kind of pivot and look at those after the presentation. So feel free to drop those in the Q&A, and I'll be able to kind of respond to if there's anything that come up or during our Q&A session. Okay, we can go ahead and go to next slide, please. So really what I want to start with, and as my peers here in this presentation and talking about serving and identifying human trafficking survivors, I wanted to start with defining what is this, right? What is human trafficking? And in the US, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, TVPA is often an acronym used, has defined trafficking as sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by forced, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act is not 18 years of age, or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, debt bondage, and other forms of labor trafficking. So I wanted to just kind of start with that broader definition. And I know my peers here on this call doing parts of the presentation may help reiterate and kind of talk about this definition and what this means to identify and define a human trafficking. And I think that's important if you're new to what this means, what is human trafficking, that'll be helpful in this kind of learning process. So what I wanted to kind of break down is these three pillars on the screen here: action, means, and purpose. So when looking to identify human trafficking through this AMP model, this can help illustrate, right, that federal definition that I just read through. And it's going to be that a minimum of one of these elements needs to be present when identifying human trafficking to be occurring. And under the federal law, again, I think it's important to note that any minor under the age of 18 induced into like commercial sex is considered a victim of human trafficking, of sex trafficking. So the under age 18, that minor cannot consent to that. So that would be identified as human trafficking. And I think something important that's also good to mention, that the Commercial Sex Act means any sex act, an account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. So I don't expect you to remember or be able to like read back these, these things to me, but just kind of start to lean into this information to learn with us. So when thinking about this first column here of action, so the stuff listed: induce, recruit, harbor, transport, provide, obtain, solicit. So what that means is like that refers to that action that a trafficker may take, right? So for example, a potential exchange or the soliciting of exchanging sex for rent, like, right, or being able to do XYZ, where you may see some of that come up, examples like that. So I think that's a good example to kind of make mention of right now. And thinking of means is what the trafficker like employs, right? So this like a force, fraud, coercion, right? So thinking of force, physical assault, sexual assault, potential isolation, fraud, that false deception, offers of employment, lying about work conditions, withholding wages or documentation, and or concern, the threats of violence against a person or family member, and potentially withholding legal documentation too. So some examples of how that could show up. So, and then the purpose is the end goal of why, but what's behind the why, or the why behind the action, right? Why are they doing this? So for example, someone's promised a job teaching, right? But then once they, or a job for a family friend or something like that. And once they go there, right, to that state, they find the job is not, they're not getting paid. They're actually working in a different type of service industry, and they're not paid for what they're doing now, but then they have this debt so that they may have to work off, right? And the rent that they would then also be occurring. So there's some different types of scenarios and experiences that could happen that potentially that look to meet this action, means, and purpose when identifying folks as a victim of human trafficking through the Violence Victims Protection Act of 2000. I also think it's really important to note that throughout this presentation, right, we'll share stats, we'll share different things that we are aware of and our different intersecting movements. But because human trafficking is often underreported and under-identified, at times some of these statistics, right, they're at times inaccurate, or there might not be a clear figure as to how many people experience trafficking in the US, right? Not all persons of trafficking have been able to access services or been reported their experience. So at times those statistics and the HT side of things could potentially be underreported, right, and not contain accurate numbers right now with what we're seeing. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So what I want to talk about too here is the types of human trafficking. So I want to dive into a little bit further. Again, what I had verbally reviewed: sex trafficking, thinking of the defined as recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of a person for the purpose of commercial sex act. So when thinking and breaking that down, I feel like oftentimes the sex trafficking is more talked about, right? It's more sensationalized by media at times. And this is oftentimes if people haven't been exposed to human trafficking, what they have heard about more of, right? Or where there's at times a conflation into like what is human trafficking. I think it's important to mention, as here secondarily and in the formal definition, labor trafficking is also, right, that recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision of obtaining a person for labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion. So again, thinking about people can experience labor and sex trafficking in the same situation, right? So someone could experience one or both, and like these potential experiences could intersect. So I think it's important to note that there are two types of human trafficking. There are more outside of that too, but I think it's important to note in this conversation the difference between sex and labor trafficking. If we can go ahead and go to next slide, please. So here I just wanted to talk about some potential like venues, right? Thinking about where sex trafficking could happen. I would just like to also name, this is not an all-inclusive list, right? That trafficking, where it happens and how it happens, it is not only occurring and happening in these listed potential venues. I also think it's important, just as noted on the slide, that sex trafficking and sex work, like they do not equal, like they are not same, right? So just because someone is doing sex work does not equal them experiencing sex trafficking. And so wanting to kind of talk about the federal law too, right, distinguishes between sex work and sex trafficking, again, except for in cases of minors or in cases where that forced erotic coercion is occurring. And really, when thinking about some examples of how this may show up in potential housing work or folks that you're supporting in your housing counseling roles, it could be potentially, right, if they're experiencing some of that housing instability or potentially having to being forced to exchange sex for rental assistance, right, or having their housing potentially dependent upon, right, that they are continuing to be trafficked and such. So there may be experiences, increased vulnerabilities with the housing instability. For example, someone may have experienced sex trafficking as a child or previously as an adult. And because of that previous trauma, they are experiencing some of the housing instability, right, and or rental needs that is correlated to some of that previous trauma, but not currently experiencing trafficking. And that could be at times where you're working with someone and identifying maybe that like long-term rental instability and such that they may be able to share some of that trauma. And they could also be connected to potential local resources to support that previous human trafficking experience that's still impacting their rental and housing stability. So again, there's some ways in which that folks who have experienced human trafficking, that maybe haven't had access to resources, could still be impacted in housing. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so for the labor trafficking piece, again, wanting to kind of talk about anywhere that work happens, human trafficking, this labor trafficking can happen, and that at times survivors of trafficking may experience both labor and or sex trafficking and or labor trafficking and or sex trafficking individually. And according to a global trafficking statistic, about 17% of trafficking survivors in the world have been trafficked for sexual exploitation, while 74 have been trafficked for forced labor and services. Like, these are more global statistics, and they often suggest that through labor, trafficking occurs more frequently than sex trafficking. The majority of the anti-trafficking dialogue surrounds around sex trafficking, right? So that forced labor, debt bondage, forced criminal activity, domestic servitude are just a few examples of human trafficking that can occur for the purposes of labor. And whether it's informal or formal work happens, human trafficking and that exploitation could happen. So people experiencing conditions of trafficking may again experience sexual trauma while in forced labor conditions, just as people experiencing sex trafficking may be in conditions of debt bondage and or forced labor. So forms of exploitation may overlap. And again, recognizing that no human trafficking experience, regardless of the type, is a first step better serving, right? Like recognizing that it's happening and serving those in the community. So again, some examples are where we've seen some work in this intersection of housing and labor trafficking. Survivors is again for folks whose employer provides housing to them, but there's some increased power dynamics, right, with an employer holding that housing in those labor trafficking scenarios. And again, how does a person kind of identify if they need to leave, right, that labor trafficking experience when also their housing is tied to the labor in which that how they're being labor trafficked. So again, some ways in which that may show up in the housing realm and intersection. Please go ahead and go to next slide. So really, I think it's important to talk about acknowledging root causes of trafficking. And as some stuff listed here on the slide, right, I think, and all of us on this call may be more present and aware with, right, is thinking about the impacts of housing instability, houselessness, and how that increases vulnerabilities, right, for people in the community. And as my peers here on the call will talk about, right, that financial impact, right, oftentimes trafficking victims are generally left financially destitute, which in turn makes them susceptible to that potential re-exploitation, right? Individuals who lack safe housing are more likely to potentially engage in other things that may put them at risk and increase vulnerabilities because they need to meet, their different basic needs. I wanted to share that in 2016, a study by Loyola University and Covenant House found that nearly 1 in 5 youth who received shelter services from Covenant House had experienced some form of human trafficking. So again, thinking about that emergency shelter placement, thinking about folks who are renting their units and such, when that housing instability occurs, again, putting them more at risk of experiencing different vulnerabilities. I also think it's important to note that in a study where researchers have found in racial and gender disparities among evicted Americans, and this was in sociological science in December 2020, that researchers found that filing and eviction rates were on average significantly higher for Black renters and white renters. And the share of eviction filings and eviction judgments against Black renters was considerably higher than their share of the rental population. And why I mention that is because thinking about the compounding intersection of vulnerability, right? So with Black and or persons of color renters are experiencing higher rates of eviction than those of white renters, again, increasing that vulnerability of trafficking is going to be, again, present, right? Thinking about that, acknowledging those root issues of just how housing practices have just been historically racist and oppressive. And then also just wanted to make note that and I will be able to link and drop these links in these studies too, so you'll be able to have access to them. That again, there are different ways in which trafficking can occur. And the vulnerabilities that folks who have that may be present may impact, again, traffickers being able to offer these types of housing, right, and or employment, and then again impacting their ability of being able to leave those trafficking situations and to not be trafficked. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So wanted to think about, right, within your role potentially as you're supporting folks in your housing counseling role, what are some potential ways, right, when learning about someone's information, potentially things on their rental history, credit report, whatever that might be, that maybe kind of raises questions for you, right, or you want to know more about. So when a person shares about their situation, I'm not sure how these conversations look for you all, kind of considering and being curious around if there was expectations of their current employment, right, versus what's actually happening, right, or even previous employment. Potentially talking about, right, their earnings, was anything withheld from them, or do they have a debt that they are having to pay off with their employer? Do they receive overtime? What do those hours look like? Are they being compensated for that? Potential working conditions. And then thinking about, it's important to kind of frame those questions in a way that, right, you're leaning into understanding. And for some people, they may not even be aware that they are experiencing human trafficking, right? So if there are potential concerns or questions that you have further, on my next slide that I'll show, that we'll go to in just a moment, there can be some other resources in which that you're able to provide folks, but also thinking and leaning into your team and kind of talking about, okay, what could this be? These are some questions I have. So and it's important to frame questions whether sex or labor has been an exchange for anything, right? So again, thinking about housing, food, clothing, meeting those basic needs and that potential exchange. We can go ahead and go to next. And I think further in the presentation too, they'll talk more about some potential screening options and such like that, more formally. So I just wanted to extend that, that'll go more in depth. So in this resources page, what I think is important, so there's some just additional resources just around human trafficking that I wanted to be able to provide you all. But then also this first bullet point here, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I think this person might be experiencing human trafficking, how, and you're unsure of what those local resources are. So you can utilize this trafficking hotline as a service provider, if you will, that you're trying to connect to or identify some potential resources in your area and or the area that someone is located in, and or you're able to provide that. This is not directly to the hotline number, but it is online there. This hotline number, like that's national. So the folks that answer those calls are able to connect folks with potential resources if they're needed in their communities in which they're located. And then I also wanted to, the Office of Victims of Crime, that is also who funds us for our training and technical assistance project, but they also have additional like grantees and resources listed on their website as well. So there may be different housing resources available to folks that, again, if you're trying to do a little research to get someone connected to, that they may be able to, again, this is a more national scope of providers. And then again, more on the lower half here, some just additional resources focused on housing and human trafficking. So I just wanted to be able to share those as well. And then you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I just wanted to kind of leave you with where there's a link to our resource library. Again, this is kind of the more in-depth resource access that we have. If there's further questions or just in like your local area that you need to have just like more like intimate or in-depth conversations with us about, like if you're unsure what to do around this housing and identifying and or serving human trafficking survivors, in whatever capacity that might look like, you're able to reach out to our training email at training@freedomnetworkusa.org. And if there's a more direct conversation that you'd like to have with me, I also listed my email that you're able to reach out to me to. And with that, I will pass it on to our next presenter.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nkira Aduba. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Capacity Building Manager at CSAJ, which is the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice. We're a national organization that helps advocates, organizations, and systems respond to the self-defined economic needs of domestic violence. Today, I will be speaking on consumer rights and economic justice for survivors and trying to make some connections between domestic violence field and trafficking in an attempt to show some useful strategies that can be used by advocates when partnering or working with trafficking survivors. Next slide, please. So there is a marked overlap in the pattern of behaviors that domestic violence abusers use and traffickers use. They usually try to exert power and control over the victim or survivor, and also sometimes trafficked individuals sometimes live with their trafficker and are subjected to like physical violence, emotional manipulation, and control. These are also some of the hallmarks of domestic violence. Another common form of abuse that is common to both domestic violence and trafficking is economic abuse. Next slide, please. So what is economic abuse? This involves behaviors that control a person's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, threatening their economic security and potential for self-sufficiency. So what does this look like? Examples of this range from turning off the person's alarm when they're supposed to go to work so that the person misses work. It also looks like the abuser showing up at the person's work. It also looks like depriving the survivor of access to food, access to transportation as well, denying childcare as well. Those are some of the examples of economic abuse. Denying the person access to joint money or the person's own earned money. Next slide, please. So the economic impact of domestic violence is wide and broad. It ranges from income and job loss to housing instability, to limited transportation, to decreased access to childcare. There's a reciprocal relationship between domestic violence and economic insecurity. Abuse creates economic instability for survivors, and then poverty in turn reduces the options that survivors have to access safety. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at this diagram is the economic ripple effect. CSAJ coined the term economic ripple effect of domestic violence, which basically is shows like the different instances or different stages in which a survivor goes through and the economic impact that the survivor faces at the different stages of their life. And we apply this in this situation to trafficking survivors, so the different stages. We often say at CSAJ, there is no safety without economic security. This relates to the link between abuse and poverty. The way abuse creates like ripples of restriction, of options of safety. This is what we call the economic ripple effect of violence. So when we look at the different stages, you have during the trafficking now, survivors have no or limited access to safe and affordable housing, limited access or no access to transportation, food, employment, no work authorization to get another job legally because some of survivors are undocumented or on expired visas. They have no resume, sometimes no formal job experience, and they also may not want to leave the situation. And then when they try to start safety seeking, looking for safety, they also face challenges with limited access to transitional housing. They're often prey to sex for rent schemes. There's also, when they try to move and they have pets, there's lack of spaces that allow pets. There are discriminatory practices at shelters. There's less availability for transgender and survivors with disabilities. There's limited access to transportation. And then in the short term, there's also the same issue of limited or no access to safe and affordable housing. And then income-based housing has extensive wait lists. There are challenges with not having money for security deposits, not having credits. There are criminal records that also prohibit access to loans. And then for employment, there are like difficulties in explaining gaps in employment. They don't have nice clothes to show up at interviews for. They're not able to work because of the trauma they have experienced or health. And then in the long term, you still have the issue of no or limited access to safe and affordable housing. Sometimes they have to live near registered sex offenders. I have to move multiple times because they're afraid of the trafficker finding them. They have immigration issues, their medical costs. Then immigrants also feel unprotected or stuck. The process of obtaining visas is long and they feel like they can't return to their homes. I would like to know here that this ripple effect, all these challenges were outlined in partnership with the Freedom Network at one of the listening sessions that was conducted with advocates who work with survivors. So these are real life situations and challenges that I'm sharing with you today. Next slide, please. So this is also just a continuation of the different stages as well. So there are immigration barriers, there's slut shaming. This is still in the during stage. And then when they're safety seeking, they're prey to predatory loans, loss of income, being threatened by ICE as well. And then in the short term, you also have like legal immigration status required for applications. And then in the long term, you have compounding issues like have not paid taxes, and then no backup childcare and lack of awareness or connection to resources. Next slide, please. So after discussing like the economic ripple effects for facing trafficking survivors, how do we disrupt this ripple effect? How do we intervene? One powerful way we advocate for is through survivor-centered economic advocacy. Next slide, please. So what is this? So what it involves is basically building a partnership with survivors and the advocate. So allowing the survivor to guide you in providing assistance. Basically, it's a partnership. It basically starts from the survivor's perspective. So understanding the broad risk analysis. It also integrates the advocate's knowledge and resources into the survivor's framework review. So we have to build partnership. We have to partner with the survivor. Power is key. Why we emphasize survivor-centered economic advocacy is because it responds to trauma in partnership. It understands the survivor's goals and values and risks. It provides economic skills and strategies, and it focuses on reducing risk and building long-term agency, economic agency. So what we're trying to do here is to make sure that the survivor feels like they're safe and they have agency to carry out decisions that affect their life. So we're not going to impose our views or our perspectives or judgment on what the survivor is going through at their situation. Next slide, please. Survivor-centered economic advocacy basically addresses the wide range of safety issues and needs that the survivor has. We are working with the goal of safer. So you're trying to get the survivor to a safer place because we can't always guarantee safety. So we're trying to move from this unstable place to a place that is safer. And then survivor-centered economic advocacy also works to reduce survivors' economic risks based on their values, goals, priorities. So you're taking direction from the survivor as well. And it focuses on increasing the survivor's self-determination. Next slide, please. So what survivor-centered economic advocacy is calling us to do is to establish a sense of safety with the survivor before asking economic questions. Also being honest and transparent with the survivor about why we're asking the questions and what the information we're gathering, where it will go to. And it's also about giving them choices about answering whether they want to answer the questions or not. And also being aware of our own power. So are we, and how we are using it. So are we steering the survivor in a direction that is based on our own judgments? So we have to, in some ways, suspend our judgment and listen to what the survivor is telling us about their own situation. Next slide, please. So why do we emphasize the use of survivor-centered economic advocacy? There's research and data that has shown that when survivors work with advocates who use a survivor-centered model, that they have less difficulty obtaining community resources, they experience less violence over time, they report a higher quality of life and higher levels of social support, they have fewer depressive symptoms, greater quality of life, and increased optimism and internal tools. Next slide, please. So we always emphasize the focus on consumer rights advocacy. We think it's very important when working with survivors, both of trafficking and domestic violence. Why we emphasize that is because we know it has the potential to equip survivors with critical information, tools, and options to address profound and long-term economic harms stemming from abuse. So what it looks like, consumer rights advocacy looks like, is legal and non-legal advocacy to help with issues of credit repair. It could be student loans, could be bankruptcy and foreclosure. We feel like this is a more effective way of working with survivors. Next slide, please. Why we think it's important is because for us in the domestic violence movement, most of the work has focused on how to maximize survivors' future income, stuff like job literacy and financial literacy, but not enough effort has been put into remedying like survivors' accrued economic damage, which includes like if they have lots of survivors that we see usually have may have some bad credit records or may need credit repair and stuff like that, because this impacts their access to housing. So we find that consumer rights advocacy is better in remedying some of this damage, and it helps survivors in the long term. Next slide, please. So these are some of our resources which go deeper into some of the things I touched upon today. So we have the Starting Economic Conversation guide. We also have the Access to Justice e-course, which is for non-lawyer legal advocates who work with survivors. And then we have several chapters in our guidebook on credits and predatory lending. We also have various resources on the CSAJ website and past webinars on like survivor-centered economic advocacy, where you can get really steeped into all the tips and tricks of how to go about practicing it. Next slide, please. These are some other resources, and we also have done like a economic ripple effects facing immigrant survivors as well, and have a series of advocacy solutions that can also be applied in your work with trafficking survivors as well. And we have a compendium on coerced debt as well. Next slide. So I'll hand over to the next speaker, and if you have any questions or want to reach out with for any of these resources, or we also provide technical assistance if you have any issues related to our work, you can reach us at info@csaj or reach me directly at nkuru@csaj.org. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Hi, everyone. My name is Carla Sanchez-Adams. I'm a senior attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. Prior to being at NCLC, I was a managing attorney at a legal services organization, and I managed a team called the Survivor-Centered Economic Advocacy Team, where we represent victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, using just what Nkuru shared, survivor-centered approach, consumer law to help remedy some of the effects of economic abuse. And specifically, one of the things that we focused on was on coerced debt, which is the way that the term is described. It is debt that is incurred without the consent of the victim. So consent being something that can't be effective or can't happen if you're coerced into it. So basically threat of violence, force, things like that, that Carrie described early in her presentation, that, first little bucket that she talked about, being induced and coerced, or just theft in general, ID theft. So, you didn't consent to it, you didn't know about it. And so that's kind of the debt that I focused on. And I focused on it from the perspective of the reporting aspect. So it appearing on a credit report, which then impeded the survivor's ability to get housing, to get any other type of credit. So for a car loan or a mortgage or even a cell phone utility, and also to get a job, because it would appear on an employment background screening report, because it contained a credit report as well. So I know that you guys all are generally, what I've heard, is experts or have good understanding of credit reports, because that's what you do as counselors. You help people understand where their credit is, because you want them to get good credit to be able to qualify for housing, whether it's in a mortgage or a rental context. And so, that's what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm not going to be focusing on the collection of the debt, which is a separate part. right? So again, common scenario, a trafficker either uses the victim's identity without her knowledge or permission. So because he's stolen, I'm going to say she, but it could be he as well. So just for simplicity, most of my clients were female also, but stole their identity, stole all of their documents, and then was able to take out loans in their name or put a lease in their name or do whatever in their name, true identity theft, or force them to, again, under that coercion inducing piece of like, you will sign this or else ... They knew that something bad would happen to them or to a loved one, a pet, a family member, etc. So I'm not going to deal with the collection of that debt, just with the reporting on the credit report, because that's what you guys need to know. Next slide, please. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is what governs credit reports, or as the term is actually defined in the statute, consumer reports, it was amended last year by the Debt Bondage Repair Act. So that was passed in December of last year. No, that's not right. The year before that, 2021. And then last year was when rulemaking was done by the CFPB. So you can move to the next slide, please. I'm still living in 2022 over here, guys. So 2021 December is when it passed. And then there was rulemaking that the CFPB had to do within, a very short period of time after that bill was passed. So the CFPB had to do that, and that became effective last July. So I'll go through that in the next slide, but just so you know, here's what I'm going to be covering. Sorry. Go back to the other slide. I got ahead of myself, but just so you know, I will be talking about the overview of the rights and remedies under this new provision, the terms and definitions, because it's going to have terms about trafficking victim and how that's defined, as well as documentation to prove you're a victim. So I'm going to go through all of that. And then very last, practical tips on if you want to help somebody to avail themselves of these remedies and these new protections, how do you do that? Okay, now you can go to the next slide. So as I was talking about before, this new provision, basically the bill creates a new provision, which is 1681C-3. I know you guys aren't lawyers. I have this in here in case you are really bored one night and want to look up the law. I have all of the citations to the law here because that's what I do. I'm a lawyer. But just so you know, it basically creates a new provision that requires blocking of all information that resulted from trafficking. And I'll go into what that means in more depth later, but that's what the new provision did. Again, as I said, CFPB did rulemaking. What the rulemaking does is it implements a regulation V. So that is the part of the rules that implement the FCRA. So if you ever hear lawyers talking about Reg V or FCRA, they're kind of one and the same, but it's more in depth. It has more comments. So here's what the statute, that's the FCRA statute, says, and then Reg V explains it better so you understand, oh, that's what they mean. The final rule became effective July of last year. So that means that you can use it as of today. You could have used it before today as well. But just so you know, moving forward, you can use this. Okay, next slide, please. So here is what the provision does. This is in the Bureau's own words. I just have it in there for you to look at, but it essentially is very, and I'll go through this later on, but it's pretty broad because it doesn't just cover the credit reports that you all are probably used to, which is Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax's reports, commonly known as the credit bureaus or the big three and their credit reports, but it's a very broad and it covers all consumer reports, which includes specialty consumer reporting agencies, meaning tenant screening bureaus, employment background screening bureaus, check writing, like telechecks or early warning systems that is for purposes of writing checks and opening bank accounts. So it's very, very broad and it covers all of those. All right, next slide, please. So as I said, what this new provision does is it creates a block. If you've noticed when you have these slides to the left, my left, if you're looking at it in the screen, it has the FCRA provision, which is the 15 USC, and then it has the regulation V, which is the CFR. So if you're ever wanting to go back and reference it or look at it, those are where you would find them. Again, you probably don't need to know them, but I have it there just in case. So what it does is there's a new block. And for those of you that have worked in credit reporting for a while, you know that if someone's a victim of identity theft, they can get a block of their information, right? Which basically means that the information does not appear on the person's report. It can be a trade line, meaning that it can be that account information because the whole account was a result of identity theft. It can be a portion of a debt. It can be, for example, if it was just that somebody stole their card and so the account was theirs, but just this particular amount should not be on there. It can include addresses and phone numbers. It can include inquiries. So if those inquiries shouldn't have been on there because they were like hard inquiries, which would impact their score, because it was as somebody did it as, without them knowing, without their permission, it was as a result of ID theft. And, any other adverse items of information that are on the report. So that now is available in a special provision for trafficking victims. So trafficking victims can get any information that is on any consumer report that resulted from trafficking, they can get that blocked. So again, will not appear on the report. It will still be in the consumer's file, but it will not appear on any report. Next slide, please. Already covered this, so I'm going to skip it. Next slide, please. So the way that the regulations describe or define trafficking is based on what the TVPA, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act that was mentioned earlier by Carrie. That is how these two definitions are defined. So it's the two buckets, the severe forms of trafficking in persons, which can be sex or labor, as well as sex trafficking. Why they're separate, that's just how the statute is. Don't ask me. Next slide, please. So here's the definition. Again, this was what was already mentioned by Carrie, but just again, to have it on there, this is how it's defined. So sex trafficking, which is, again, commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion. They're induced to perform such an act. They haven't obtained 18 years of age, or they were recruited, harbored, transported, all of those things for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, personage, debt, bondage, or slavery. So again, sex trafficking or labor trafficking. So that's the severe form. Next slide, please. And then there's the sex trafficking itself. So this is that definition again. I think that the difference, Carrie's probably much more steeped in this than I am, but I think the difference is the first one includes that under 18 age provision. This one doesn't, so it's more broad, more general. But that is they're basically those two buckets. So if a person meets the definition of either sex trafficking or severe forms of severe forms of trafficking, then they will qualify for help under this new provision. Next slide, please. So what do you have to include in a request to block? What does the victim have to include? So the nice thing about this provision is that a victim can do this or a representative of the victim. So if for example, again, like I'm just thinking about my previous practice, a lot of times my clients were not English speakers. So they had a very hard time navigating the system. And again, because it was survivor centered, I wanted to eliminate as many barriers as possible for my clients. So they were oftentimes they were dealing with a divorce or a protective order hearing, or, like their kids are getting a new job or stability. So I was like, okay, why would I make you write this thing that it may be very hard for you to do, and also go to the post office to send it by certified mail when I can do that for you? Let's eliminate this block, this barrier for you. So You can help someone by doing this. You can be their representative, or a family member could be a representative, somebody who's trusted, a social worker, or if they're at a shelter. So the documentation down here where I have proof of identity, that can be the proof of identity of the representative. It doesn't have to be the consumer if somebody else is helping, or the victim if somebody else is helping them. But generally, these are the three documentation pieces of documentation you need. They don't call the proof of identity documentation. The regulations only call the proof of them being a victim and the documentation of the information that's adverse. Those two things are called documentation, but really it's these three documents that you're going to need to put in the request to block. Next slide, please. So again, these are the two categories of what they call trafficking documentation. So it's the victim determination that they're a victim of trafficking, and the identified adverse items of information. Those are the titles that they use. Next slide, please. So for the victim determination, these are the four things that they say you can use. So it would be a determination by a federal, state, or tribal government entity. So that could be, for example, a lot of my clients were immigrants, and so they would have a T visa. That would be sufficient to show that somebody is a trafficking victim. But it could be something else. So it could be for example, here they have a court of competent jurisdiction, which includes certain documents filed. So if a victim is assisting in the prosecution of her trafficker, which we know is rare, but sometimes it happens, and there's testimony or there's any kind of police report, things like that, that could be used. Also, an NGO or human trafficking task force, if they're authorized by a federal, state, or tribal government entity, we read that pretty broadly. So we would think if you receive funding, like VOCA funding or something like that, then you can do an attestation or have documentation that this person, certifying this person is a victim of trafficking. And then there is actually a self-attestation first. So again, kind of what everybody was talking about, it's very difficult. Victims don't trust the government, may not trust police because of their experience in the past. So they may be fearful of using these institutions. And so it may be that they prefer to do self-attestation because it makes them feel safer. And this is something that they can do. It can be signed or certified. So if they don't want to interact again with the federal, state, or tribal government entity, an authorized representative of these entities, meaning, again, like that could be and I've done this, I've assisted a client to go to the police and have them, basically they have this document and the police certifies it. So they just sign it and certify it. So you could do something like that if they don't want to go through the formal procedure of filing a complaint, a criminal complaint against their trafficker because they're scared, or having to go to court or something like that. Next slide, please. The adverse item of information, that's the second one. So that would be where again, the consumer's representative or the consumer saying, here's all the information on my report that should not be on here because it resulted from trafficking. So I know that I've heard that some of y'all use a tri-merged report. You would not want to do that to help prepare this because the information that's going to appear on each report is going to be different, and you're going to be disputing or requesting that block from each individual consumer reporting agency. So if it's something on an Experian report, you need that Experian report, and then you would list out all the information and send that to Experian. Same if you were doing it for Equifax or TransUnion. If it was a tenant screening report, let's say it was like a real page report, you would want to dispute it with them. So you're going to want a copy of that report, not a tri-merge. So you would, the consumer has the right to get access to that for free once every 12 months. If they're a victim of identity theft, they can get that once every 6 months. Y'all can probably help them access it. I know some housing counselors have access to pulling reports without it dinging their credit. So you want to get that. And then the consumer would say, okay, these accounts, whether it's adverse account, I'm sorry, whether it's, a collection account, or if it's a credit card account, whatever type of account. Again, addresses. So it might be that that the person lived with their trafficker and they don't want to be associated with that address, because in future mail or correspondence might go to that address. They don't want it linked to them at all. So they can dispute that information, phone numbers, things like that. So you would include all of that. And then you would, and say that you don't want it to be, obviously it's like a dispute letter. If you've ever helped anyone write a dispute letter, you would say, I am a victim of, severe form of trafficking or sex trafficking. This is all the information that resulted from trafficking that I don't want to appear on my report. I'm requesting a block. And then crucially, very crucial, they have to have information, contact information. So it has to either be a physical address or an email. But that is where the consumer reporting agency is going to contact the victim to let them know about the outcome of the block. They won't use that for any other reason. They're not allowed to under the regs. They're not allowed to use that address for any other reason. So again, safety being paramount. Presumably you could use the address of a shelter or an email address of, again, the representative could be their email address, but keep in mind that the person would have to stay there for at least 25 days, which is the length of the final determination of the block, to get that information. So you want it to be, that's the challenge sometimes with working with some of these clients, is if they're in transitional living or they're not going to be somewhere for a while, you want it to be an address that they will have access to for a while. So email might be better. Next slide, please. Again, I have this here. I just said it, but it's there. Next slide, please. So the proof of identity, they have to prove that they are the victim. And so here, there is no specific type of ID required. That was part of the rulemaking period, which was open to comments. One of the things that we asked was, a lot of times victims don't have any documents at all because their trafficker has kept their documents, or they've lost them. If they were a child trafficking victim, they might never have had those documents because they were taken when they were quite young. So for that reason, to say you have to provide, an ID, like a state ID, like a driver's license or something like that, or a birth certificate, something they may not have, is going to be cumbersome and is going to impede them being able to get this relief. So again, the rule says that the CRAs, the consumer reporting agencies, have to develop reasonable requirements, including confirmation questions or other non-documentary needs. So it's not specific, but I would say if you're having challenges, complain to the CFPB, absolutely, because they're going to want to know about this. They're the ones who are enforcing it. They're the ones who wrote the rules. So it's extremely important that if you're having those issues, file a complaint with the CFPB. And also, reach out to, and I'll have at the very end of my presentation, I have some resources. You can reach out to lawyers who work in FCRA who sue on this. I'm sure they'd love to sue the CRA since they already do it. I know I enjoyed it because they asked for it a lot of times. They just would never fix their problems. And so, make sure that this isn't a reason that you give up, or the victim gives up is because they can't prove their identity. It has to be flexible enough to allow somebody to prove they are who they say they are. Next slide, please. So now here's kind of where we get into like, well, should somebody do this? And I'm just going to be real with you guys for a second. First of all, I know that this might be hard because as Carrie mentioned earlier, someone's not going to come in, when you're trying to identify a person who's a victim of trafficking, they're not going to come in and say, hey, I'm a victim of trafficking, please help me. There might be other red flags. It might be something that they either don't necessarily say, but there might be some red flags that ask you to dig a little deeper, or you might feel that you're not super equipped. And so you could ask them like, hey, do you have other support networks that are helping you right now? Can we work together, things like that. But the main thing is, if somebody has identified, or you suspect that somebody has been a trafficking victim, or even a victim of like domestic violence or some other kind of violence, you want to make sure that anything that you ask them to do will not compromise their safety. And you want to make sure that, as Nkiru mentioned, that this is something that they choose and they want to do, that they have agency and decide to do it, because if you don't, they likely won't follow up on it. Likely what will happen is that they will, in your meeting, say, yes, let's do it, and then ghost you, and you will never hear back from them again, because it's not really something they wanted to do, or they were fearful. But because of being with you and that kind of, there's this, this certainly happened in my practice, this assumption of, you're the lawyer, you're the expert, I do whatever you tell me to do, but then I actually don't really want to, I'm just scared, and I'm going to say that while I'm in this meeting. It's a coping mechanism of trauma, of acquiescing. So you want to make sure that this is driven by them, and ask them, if it's safe. That can be a question that you even ask at the point of accessing a report, because if you are sticking in an address to access your report, this happened with my clients, when you're putting in your name, your current address, if it's not this, if you haven't lived there more than it's where you live now, and then any previous address, if you haven't lived there for more than 2 years, if the abuser or the trafficker has access to their information and can also pull their report, then they would be able to see any new addresses associated with the survivor, which is why this new provision specifically says the CRA can't put in that contact information in that report, so that the trafficker or abuser won't have access to it. But if you're gaining the report to begin with, that might be a concern. So you want to find out if the person feels safe. Do they have the desire and ability to get the victim determination documents? This is what I talked about earlier. So if they have to interact with law enforcement, government officials, or other entities that they're scared of, or they distrust, they may not want to go through this. And they may decide, well, I'd rather live with the debt, or I'd rather, have to maybe even pursue bankruptcy. They may want other options than having to go this route. So you want to talk to them about that. So again, I just wrote, be mindful of triggers or traumatization when engaging in any type of advocacy. I think this is a part of why I would recommend getting, technical assistance or more training on what it means to be trauma informed, and how to respond to folks that have experience trauma, because it can be, talking about finances is stressful. You all know that. But when it's associated with other forms of traumas, then it's even more heightened. So you just want to be mindful of that. If somebody needs to take a break, if they need to have water, it can even be like, what is your office setting like? Is there a desk in between you? Do you want to, do they need a pillow or something? The lighting. So it's just thinking through some of these things. Next slide, please. So again, let's say they decide, yes, want to do the block, and you have all the documentation you need. You have the identifying them as a victim, you have the identifying the adverse information, you have the proof of identity. Then where do you send it? What do you do? So under this new provision, they're required to provide 2 mailing addresses. So it could be the regular mailing address for all disputes. So, if you go to Experian or Equifax, it would have that information there. But then there's also has to be a specific mailing address just for trafficking block requests. So you could use either of those 2. Next slide, please. Now, this isn't mandatory. It's suggested that if they have a website that's specifically Experian and Equifax, each of them have a website, but they can set up a website address specifically for trafficking block requests. So basically where you would be able to actually do the block online, as opposed to sending that documentation by snail mail. If they already receive other disputes, then they also have to do it for trafficking block requests. So because the big 3 already do, they're going to have to set this up where they have, where you can send the block there too. I will say that Generally, as a lawyer practitioner, I did not like doing anything electronically because I wanted proof that they received it. So I sent it by certified mail, return request receipt. And that way I had proof that they got it, because it also has the date that they got it, because a lot of these protections is like they have 4 days to block, then they have, 5 days to provide, we'll go through those, like certain notices and a final determination. So I wanted to know, hey, did they comply with this? Did they send it the right, time? So I wanted that. Whereas, when you do it by email, it's a little different. You don't have that, you don't have the same paper trail, quite frankly. But some of my clients, if they wanted to do it on their own and this was quicker, faster for them in a less stress-free way, and they didn't anticipate us going to litigation or having to, basically set it up that way, then that's certainly, an option. And so that may be an option for you all, and if you are helping victims. The CRAs are also required to add information on their website about how to submit the trafficking documentation and proof of ID. So as I mentioned before, they have discretion about the type of identity documents that they can that they will receive. So they have to have that on their websites. And then the big three, they also have to have a toll-free number to respond to inquiries over the phone related to trafficking documentation submission. So basically you could call and say, hey, what's the status of my request? So because this provision is so new, I have zero feedback for you all about how this is working, but this is what the statute says. So let me know in the future how this is working if you try to use it. Next slide, please. After you send the block, here's the notices and the timing that I was mentioning. They have 4 days to block that information. But if they need additional information, so let's say somebody sends a request, but they don't include that proof of identity. So the CRA has to provide within 5 business days, basically a notice saying, hey, we need more info. We need, this letter that you said that had some, adverse information. You didn't actually list the adverse information. You just said that there was some in there. So can you actually tell us what it is? Or, hey, you sent us proof of ID and adverse info, but you didn't send us supporting, trafficking, that you're a victim. You didn't send us any of the supporting documents. So that would be what that would be for. Next slide, please. So again, these are the 3 things. They can only request additional info if they can't confirm the victim's identity or the identity of the representative. They didn't provide the victim determination, or they can't properly identify the adverse items. So exactly what I just said, that's the only reason they can request additional information. Next slide, please. They cannot specifically ask for validity of facts or circumstances. So they basically can't say, we don't believe you. They can't they also cannot say, all this adverse information, are you sure that it really resulted from trafficking? We don't believe you. They can't say that either. The final determination. So let's say, you send the request to block, and then they say, we need more info. Their final determination after that, to say, yes, we're going to block, or no, we're not going to block, or we blocked, but then we needed more info, so we're going to rescind the block. All of that has to be done within 25 business days after receiving the request. Next slide, please. And then the only reason they can decline or rescind a block is if they provide notice, basically saying, hey, we need more information. And then after attempting to resolve it, any of those deficiencies, like they don't have the proof of the ID, they don't have the victim determination, or the identifying adverse info is not clear enough, then for only one of those reasons can they decline or rescind a block. Next slide, please. So again, I reiterated those 3 things, only reason why they can decline it. And again, they cannot make a determination based on the validity of the facts or circumstances. They are not allowed to do that. Next slide, please. So in its final determination, which again has to be done, they have to give a notice of it to the victim within 5 business days after making that determination. So if that has to be the 25 days completed, they have 5 business days to send that notice. And it has to include a statement that we've completed a review. Here's the outcome. So outcome is, yes, we've blocked all the information. The block is there, or no, we didn't block. And here's why we didn't block it. So they have to explain it, like, oh, you didn't provide this document. You didn't do this. And then if requested, which just a new consumer report provided at no cost. The reason it says if applicable is because some of the specialty consumer reporting agencies actually don't keep a report. They only compile one at the moment that they're requested one. So, but I don't think you guys will get into that. So if you do, let me know, reach out to me. A description of the procedures used to make the determination. So saying, here's what we looked at, here's how we, why we ruled the way we did. You gave us all the documents, or you didn't give us the documents. And then an appeal method, or a method to revise to cure. So again, like, if you will send us this document you didn't send us, then we may we will block it or something. So they have to give you a method for being able to do that, and a link to the CFPB's consumer complaint portal. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know we're running out of time, but I have some resources here. So we in CLC, we write manuals, and one of the ones we write is on Fair Credit Reporting Act. So, if you can get access to it and subscribe, especially if you want to, I don't think you guys would need it, but if you want to be a lawyer or if you want to do advocacy work, then I highly recommend for advocacy work that you do get a copy of that. If you want to find a consumer lawyer in your state, in your area that may take FCRA cases, the National Association of Consumer Advocates has a find an attorney tool. And these are lawyers who specialize it, and you can list FCRA as a practice area. The CFPB's complaint database. I mentioned that before because it's really important. This is how the CFPB tracks how this rule is being implemented, and if how the CRAs are actually responding to it. So it's crucial that that information is put on there. Plus, it is required that the party that you're complaining about respond to you within 14 days. So often that will resolve a dispute or a complaint. Next. Please, next slide, please. Contact information. And I think that's it. The next slide, I think, is just a question slide.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carrie. So do we have questions in the queue?
Yes, we do have a few questions. The first is, and if you guys, whoever, this question applies to, you can just come off, you can answer the question. So the first question is regarding the block on credit and other bureaus for trafficking victims. When trying to obtain this block, is there any proof required on part of the victim to show that they were indeed a victim?
If that's the person who followed up saying, Carla's answering the question I asked regarding documentation.
Yes.
So I think we answered that.
All right, here's another question. Why does the block for trafficking have to be reported to each bureau individually? If it's fraud or ID theft, you only have to report to one and they must notify the others.
That's actually not true. So I think you're thinking about a fraud alert. If you're asking for a fraud alert to be placed, then yes, you just have to tell one of the 3 CRAs and they report it to the others. But for a security freeze, for example, you have to request it from each individual. And for an ID theft block, which is different than a fraud alert, that has to be to each individual one. You can't just send it to one. And that's because you specifically in an ID theft block, you have to say what information is wrong as a result of ID theft. And that's going to be different from each report. I've had some reports that have like 10 credit card accounts. I've had one that had only 8. I've had one. So all of them have different information. So that's why it has to go individually to each one. And also, as a lawyer, for suing, Because if they don't comply with the procedures, how are you going to prove that unless they individually respond to you and you send those requests? So yeah.
All right, thank you for that. And the last question is for the contact address. Can it be a P.O. box? Often for folks who move a lot, we recommend accessing a P.O. box for continuity.
Absolutely.
All right, and that is the last of our questions. I'm going to turn the rest of the webinar over to Bruce, and he can close us out. Thank you all so very much, everyone, for your presentations today. And again, thank you everyone for watching. Bruce is going to close us out.
Good, and I'm going to ask one more question quickly. We had a session on domestic violence. Are there similar protections for victims of domestic violence?
Sorry, say that again.
So are there similar protections or provisions in for victims of domestic violence as opposed to people who are trafficking victims?
Not at the moment. So this block is only for trafficking victims. In my state, I'm in Texas, our definition of identity theft actually encompasses both coercion and the traditional ID theft. So we can use the ID theft block, which is similar to the trafficking block, to get that relief. But that's not available to everybody in every state. And currently the FCRA has said that, the CFPB has said that they're going to be opening rulemaking on the FCRA, which would include the ability to add additional protections like this for domestic violence survivors. So when that happens, you should write some comments and urge them to do that.
Good, and we do weigh in on those things. So that's, and we rely on the NCLC to give us some guidance typically, but all of you do a great job. And thank you so much for the excellent, I'm sure sometimes very difficult work that you do. And thank you for excellent presentations. So let's move on quickly now to just a quick reminder about NHRC's membership. And if you come to the conference, we will have a special morning session on Tuesday for members. And it will include that you get our 10-year anniversary mug. And you'll also, the first 20 people who come, they'll get a batik from Africa for Leaders in Housing Counseling batik. Which we have a few more of those. So for people who come really early on Tuesday, and we'll do a whole session on funders and kind of innovative ideas on funding for housing counseling agencies and what some of the networks are doing that really broadens the definition of how we have sustainable funding for our work. So we'll have Wells Fargo, Connie Wright there as well. We'll have a number of voices, so I think it'll be very promising. So, and join NHRC if you haven't already, and or please renew. And certainly one of the things that turns out to have become even more valuable than before is the discount on the CoreLogic Credco credit reports, and our price for tri-merged and 3 credit scores is just under $21. It's I think it's we don't have it here, but it's like $20.81. There's been a tremendous price increase on this, and so this is really the best price that I know about in the marketplace for tri-merged. So please take advantage of this if you are a member. I was doing a few calls last month and discovered members who had not actually tapped into the credit report discount. We also have one on Savvy, and we have we have a notification of unusual funding opportunities that I send out. I occasionally identify things that are outside of the mainstream but could apply to your work or your offices and the innovative work you do. And then we have the satisfaction of it's the satisfaction of supporting this work and the advocacy that we do. We really appreciate what you're doing out in the field. We want to elevate that. We want to position that, and we've been quite successful. So one of the things that's going to happen in 2 weeks is we're going to have our next workshop on on the SCIF, on the Supplemental Consumer Information Form. And that's a whole program that we started in 2016, and many of you advocated for with us. And it has the housing counseling data fields that will be included as a supplemental form to the mortgage application, and it will have language preference. And I have to say, there was a lot of industry opposition to the language preference, which may come up a little bit on our call in 2 weeks. We're going to have FHFA and Fannie and Freddie, probably the Housing Policy Council, maybe a lender, and HUD on the call as well. So kind of why it's important, how to use it. I think most important, you all will be the representatives there to speak to clients, and we want to encourage people to really use this form. Hopefully you can fill them out automatically in your CRMs soon enough, CMSs, and those are all the opportunities. So join if you haven't. You can go to our website and click onto the membership link. And definitely come to the conference on the 27th and 28th in DC. A lot of exciting things. There's more information about it on the website, and we're going to introduce the almost complete agenda shortly, and so you get a chance to see all the good things we'll be talking about. We want you to be part of the conversation. So with that, thanks so much for a good call. Please feel free, everybody, to let us know if you've got some thoughts or questions, and we'll keep doing the work. And I know you will keep doing your end of it too. Thanks. Bye.